Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to Ancient Epics, the place where the greatest stories of humanity come back to life. Picture this. In the year 1801, a lone man drifts down the Ohio River in a canoe made from two hollowed logs lashed together. Barefoot, shirtless, a sack of 40,000 apple seeds at his feet. Steering by starlight while most of the continent still belongs to wolves and bears and to nations older than any European crown. That man is about to plant orchards that will cover a territory larger than modern Germany, alter the legal borders of 5 future states, preserve more apple varieties than exist in all the royal gardens of Europe combined, and do it all while owning nothing but the clothes he refuses to wear and the leather pouch filled with mystical books. The world remembers him as the smiling cartoon Johnny Appleseed, yet the real John Chapman was a frontier ascetic, a Swedenborgian mystic, a native-allied pacifist, and one of the most successful land speculators in American history who chose poverty because he believed the earth itself was already perfect. Tonight, under the same constellations that once guided his silent journeys, let us follow the barefoot planter through 200,000 square miles of wilderness and discover why. 2 centuries later, his trees still bloom like quiet prayers across half a continent. The story begins long before John Chapman ever saw an apple seed in the ancient geology of the land itself. 65 million years ago, when the Appalachian Mountains were taller than the Himalayas are today, glaciers the size of nations ground across the future Midwest, scouring valleys and depositing a layer of rich loess soil perfect for fruit trees. Beneath that soil lay limestone and shale rich in calcium and potassium, minerals that apples drink the way desert travelers drink water. When the ice retreated 12,000 years ago, mastodons and giant sloths browsed the open woodlands, scattering the seeds of wild crabapples whose sour fruit fed the first human beings to walk the Ohio Valley. Those ancient people, the mound-building cultures we now call the Hopewell and Adena, carried dried apples on trade routes that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. By the time Europeans arrived, native nations from the Shawnee to the Miami cultivated small groves of these wild trees, grafting them with stone knives in ways that astonished the first French missionaries. Into this layered landscape, already sacred to fruit, John Chapman was born on the 26th of September, 1774, in Leominster, Massachusetts, a town whose very name comes from an Old English word for orchard by the river. His childhood was shadowed by war and loss. When John was barely 2, his mother Elizabeth died of tuberculosis, leaving his father Nathaniel to raise 2 infants alone. Nathaniel soon marched off to fight the British, serving as a Minuteman and later as a soldier under Washington. The boy grew up among apple orchards tended by women and old men, learning to graft science before he could read. Apples were everywhere in New England. Dried apples strung on attic rafters like brown rosaries, apple butter simmering in iron kettles, cider presses turning every autumn into carnival. But the cider was hard and strong, the only safe drink in a world of tainted wells. And from it came the faint warmth that helped families endure winters that could freeze the Charles River solid. John learned early that the apple was not luxury but necessity, a fruit that preserved life itself. By 1792, at age 18, John apprenticed himself to an orchardist named Crawford in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where he first encountered the cider mills that would change his destiny. Each autumn the mills pressed thousands of bushels, and from their muddy floors workers shoveled mountains of pumice, the crushed pulp and seeds left behind. Most farmers burned the pumice or fed it to hogs, but John saw treasure. Apple seeds were free for the taking, and unlike grafted trees that cost a shilling each, seeds could be grown by the tens of thousands. More importantly, seeds produced the bitter, tannin-rich apples perfect for cider, the very kind the new Homestead Act of 1800 would soon demand settlers plant to prove land claims west of the Alleghenies. A quiet obsession took root in the young man's mind. If he could get ahead of the wave of settlement and establish nurseries in the wilderness, he could supply an entire migrating nation with the one crop that satisfied both law and thirst. In the spring of 1797, he made his first journey. Loading 2 canoes with 40-bushel sacks of seeds collected from the cider presses of western Pennsylvania, he floated down the Ohio past the ruins of Fort Pitt, where the river turns golden in evening light. The river itself was a living thing then, 2,000 miles of brown water carrying logs, deer carcasses, and sometimes the bodies of those who had challenged its currents. At the confluence of the Muskingum, he beached his canoes and began the first of what would become hundreds of wilderness nurseries. With nothing but a crooked stick, he scratched shallow beds in the rich alluvial soil, scattered the seeds in careful rows, then built brush fences to keep out deer and bears. Before leaving, he planted a small sign made from bark, "John Chapman's Nursery Trees for Sale in 2 years." Then he drifted on, following the river bends where the soil smelled darkest and the sycamores grew tallest. The science of what he did was precise even if his tools were primitive. Apple seeds require cold stratification, weeks of near-freezing temperatures to break dormancy. Nature had already provided this in the cider mills where seeds lay in damp pumice through winter. John simply collected them in early spring when they were primed to sprout. He chose sites on slightly elevated ground above flood level, where the soil was a silty loam formed from ancient lake beds, perfect for root growth. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 20th century by the Ohio Historical Society have located dozens of these early nurseries by finding the characteristic stone rings he placed around each seedbed to mark his claim. Some of those stones still bear faint scratches, perhaps the only handwriting John Chapman ever left on the earth. By 1801, his circuit was established. Each spring he floated west with the high water, planting new nurseries every 20 or 30 miles. Each autumn he returned eastward on foot, barefoot even when frost silvered the grass, tending his young trees, thinning, pruning, and selling saplings to settlers who were only then catching up to his vision. He traveled an annual loop of more than 1,000 miles through what are now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and western Pennsylvania, always staying 2 or 3 years ahead of permanent settlement. The land was still legally native territory, but treaties were being signed and broken with dizzying speed. John navigated this dangerous ground with a grace no government agent could match. Shawnee elders remembered him from childhood trading journeys. Miami women brought him corn cakes when he slept beneath their council trees. He learned enough of their languages to trade stories, and he never carried a gun. When war parties passed, he greeted them with raised hands and offered dried apples from his pouch. They called him Manetto, the one who makes things grow. In 1806, he expanded northward along the Walhonding and Mohican rivers, planting nurseries that still exist today as the famous Johnny Appleseed groves near Mansfield, Ohio. One of these, the Ashery Farm site, contains trees carbon dated to 1809, their trunks now hollow but still bearing fruit. Genetic testing shows these trees carry alleles found nowhere else in modern, commercial orchards, living relics of the genetic roulette John played with every seed he sowed. Because apples are extreme heterozygotes, each seed is essentially a new variety. From the same sack might come a tree whose fruit was green and tart as a winter wind, and another whose apples melted in the mouth like honey. This diversity was priceless on a frontier where one bad harvest could mean starvation. Some apples kept for a year in root cellars dug into north-facing hillsides. Others fermented into cider that reached 12% alcohol and could be distilled into brandy that burned blue in the spoon. Every settler family needed dozens of different trees, and John Chapman became their gentle supplier. His appearance grew more distinctive with each passing year. By his 30s, he had let his hair and beard grow long and untrimmed, the color of dark cider. He wore cast-off clothing coffee sacks sewn into tunics, pants cut from flour bags, sometimes nothing but a burlap cloak in summer. His feet, tough as hickory bark, rarely knew shoes. On his head he balanced a tin pot or a pasteboard hat stiffened with bark, useful for cooking mush over campfire coals. In his leather pouch, alongside Appleseed's, he carried thin volumes printed in London by the New Church of Emmanuel Swedenborg. These books taught that the natural world was a perfect correspondence of the spiritual, every apple a mirror of divine love, every seed a soul waiting to unfold. John read them aloud to anyone who would listen. Children gathered around evening fires, lonely widows in new cabins, even Shawnee warriors who nodded politely though they understood few words. He believed the act of reading itself carried blessing, like scattering seeds on fallow ground. The War of 1812 brought terror to the frontier. British officers paid native warriors for settler scalps, and American generals burned villages in retaliation. Massacre followed massacre. River Raisin, Fort Dearborn, Coppice Hill. Yet John Chapman walked unarmed through the heart of it. In September 1812, when Shawnee and Wyandot warriors prepared to attack Mount Vernon, Ohio, John ran 18 miles barefoot through the night to warn the settlement, arriving with feet bleeding but voice calm. The militia had time to prepare, and the attack never came. Years later, when American soldiers destroyed the Shawnee village of Wapakoneta, John stood weeping among the ashes. He never condemned either side. He simply mourned the breaking of what he saw as one great family. After the war, his work accelerated. The federal land offices opened millions of acres, and the tide of settlement became a flood. John extended his nurseries westward to the Wabash and Whitewater rivers, southward into Kentucky, northward toward Lake Erie. By 1830, he controlled more than 1,200 acres of orchard land, yet his total personal possessions could fit in a wheelbarrow. Court records in Richland County, Ohio, show him transferring 40-acre orchards to widows for one worn-out horse or a promise to care for the trees. When tax assessors came, he paid in young saplings or simply walked away, claiming the earth could not be taxed. He slept beneath his own trees more often than in cabins, curling up in leaves with his feet to the fire, claiming the stars kept better watch than any roof. As he entered his 60s, the country changed around him. Steamboats replaced canoes, canals cut through his old portage paths, railroads began to stitch the wilderness together. The temperance movement declared war on hard cider, and grafted sweet-eating apples from New York began to replace his wild seedlings. Yet John never altered his mission. In 1842, at age 68, he walked from northern Ohio to Fort Wayne, Indiana, a distance of nearly 200 miles, to save a nursery threatened by land speculators. Witnesses described him arriving barefoot in November snow, beard white as apple blossoms, eyes still bright as a boy's. He won the case by producing hand-drawn maps so accurate the judge accepted them as legal proof. In March 1845, the end came quietly. Traveling his usual circuit near Fort Wayne, he stopped at the cabin of William Worth to warm his feet. That evening he read from Swedenborg by firelight, voice soft as wind and leaves. Sometime before dawn he laid the book aside, smiled, and slipped away. They buried him on a hill overlooking the St. Joseph River beneath apple trees planted 40 years earlier. No stone marked the grave for decades, but the trees themselves became his monument. In spring their blossoms fall like snow across the quiet Indiana field, and in autumn the fruit still carries flavors no modern orchard knows. Today more than 200 Johnny Appleseed trees survive, some hollow-centered giants whose DNA has been sequenced and preserved in the USDA germplasm repository. The orchards he established cooled the Midwest climate by transpiration, held topsoil against erosion, and provided the genetic foundation for every American apple that followed. His gentle legend became one of the few frontier stories without blood or conquest at its heart. So, when the autumn moon rises full and red over ripening orchards, and the air carries the faint, sweet ferment of fallen fruit, listen closely. Somewhere in the rustle of leaves is the soft footfall of a barefoot man, who believed that even in a land torn by war and greed, a single seed planted in kindness could outlast empires. Every apple that drops, every petal that drifts on spring wind, is his quiet aim into a world that still remembers how to be gentle. If these ancient voices touched your heart today, please consider subscribing to Ancient Epics and ringing the bell so you never miss the next forgotten tale. Thank you for watching.